Now, it is 6:38, and we can invite you now into our briefing room and talk to one of our leading thinkers on tactics and strategy and discuss the state of the war in Ukraine. I want to welcome Dr. Domitilla Sagramoso, Senior Lecturer in Conflict and Security at the Department of War Studies at King's College London. Domitilla, hello.
Hello, John. Thank you for inviting me.
It's good to have you here, Domitilla. Let me just start by throwing the ball, as it were, to you. You watch the situation on the ground in Ukraine all the time. We wait for the moment, if it is to be a moment, of the big counteroffensive. What do you make of what you're seeing so far?
Well, I think that on the one hand, it's clear that there is a preparation for this counteroffensive, but it's really not clear when it will take place and where exactly. And I think that is really the right approach. Because by discussing so much this counteroffensive, Ukraine sort of loses the element of surprise, which is so important in an offensive. So I think that to keep it blurred, not really tell when and where, really is going to help Ukrainians, because the Russians are sort of expecting particular areas on the front where Ukraine would be advancing, such as the areas around Zaporizhia, between Donbass and Kherson, and the areas of Crimea, also heavily fortified. So they're really trying to sort of prepare defensive positions and reinforce them, and that might make the advancements of the Ukrainians more difficult. Now, what the Ukrainians are trying to do is they are trying to find vulnerabilities. And I think what we've seen in Bakhmut was not necessarily the beginning of a counteroffensive, but Ukrainians finding vulnerabilities there, because the forces that were defending Bakhmut on the sort of more lateral sides, not in the center of the city, but on the north and southern fringes, were forces that were not very strong and well prepared and heavily trained. So I think that was an opportunity which Ukraine, with the new equipment that it received, was able to sort of take advantage of.
Now, Domitilla, I'm sure you noticed the statement from General Budanov, the head of Ukrainian military intelligence, when he spoke openly online about a policy of agents of Ukraine assassinating Russian pro-war propagandists. I was surprised to see that, and certainly to see it discussed so openly. What did you make of that?
Yes, I think he sort of admitted in this interview. I mean, the sections that I've heard that that somehow they were involved with eliminating these individuals. First of all, let me note that these were very fierce critics of Ukraine, and the rhetoric that they were employing was extremely violent towards Ukraine. I mean, they talk openly about eliminating Ukrainians. It's almost like a call to genocide. So one can understand that the Ukrainians are very worried, and that this sort of narrative sort of catches further among the Russian population. But nevertheless, I think it's quite a worrying development. I think we should not allow Ukraine to rely on this kind of terrorist tactics, which really do not correspond to the way one should address these kind of individuals, which I think should be according to international law, and to try to prosecute these individuals in a court of law. Now, this might be very difficult, because it's going to be very hard to prosecute anyone in the regime of Putin or in his entourage, or these individuals who are very vociferous. But I think we should really try to send the message to Ukraine that if they want to be part of Europe and of the West, if they want to get support, there are red lines which are very important to us. And as this applies to hitting very deep in Russian territory, it also should relate to the kind of methods that they utilize, which are not really according to the rule of law.
Right. So I presume you object on grounds of just basic principle, but also I sense you feel it could be militarily counterproductive. Just expand on that thought for me.
Yes, this is very important, because it could really give ammunition to those in Russia who are arguing. They've been arguing from the very beginning that Ukrainians are all very violent fascists or Nazis, that they want to destroy the Russian people as well. There's been these narratives which have sort of been very much amplified in the Russian media and by Russian officials. So these kind of announcements, they really can be used by the Russian leadership to justify their actions, to rally the population inside Russia, and also, which I think is very important, to use as a sort of a PR line, internationally, among constituencies or countries which are more hesitant. There are many elements in the public in Western countries who are very worried, who have been arguing that, Ukrainians are indeed, very extremists. And these kind of, assessments or declarations and tactics, can really backfire. And they can also rally the Russian population, because the Russians are going to feel very scared that if Ukraine advances. So I think they need to be clarified. Budanov, for example, in a previous declaration that he made about killing Russians, he said, no, only those who are committing atrocities and war crimes. I think here he should clarify either that this is not acceptable and that they're not going to carry out with these kind of activities, to make sure that, this is not a line that is to be pursued and that then can be used, internally in Russia and also internationally by the Russian leadership.
And what did you make of this Ukrainian general discussing his idea that he would wish to see, when the fighting ceases or stops, the establishment of a demilitarized zone 60 miles from the border into Russia? Now, one can imagine why that might appeal to General Budanov, but as an idea, again, to throw out there, because that would represent, I don't know, a very conspicuous defeat for Russia, would it not?
Yes, although I think that the only way, if eventually we come to some kind of negotiation and, to ensure that there is a sort of a long-term peace agreement, or some kind of some kind of arrangement that resists, any kind of violation and that is secure for the longer term, we need some form of demilitarization along the border. And I think we really will have to eventually think of going back to the kind of arrangements we had by the end of the Cold War, for example, the CFE Treaty, which regulated the amount of heavy military equipment that NATO and at the time it was still the Warsaw Treaty, but then it was adapted to Russia, was implemented. And I think that these kind of, agreements on the kind and amounts of weaponry that are allowed in a certain theater, are important and relevant. Now, of course, Ukraine is going to object to that. That's why we really need to give Ukraine very strong security guarantees as well. And I think that what is happening in Ukraine today is that they're really, in a way, this example which we mentioned earlier is relevant in that respect, is that Ukraine is really following a bit the Israeli model of defense, of trying to be relying on itself, on strong armed forces, on tactics which have been used by Israel. Israel has also eliminated opponents with brute force on a single operations. And I think that we have to see and find ways through which we can guarantee Ukraine's security in a more sort of effective way than we did in the past. So as to make sure that, that Ukraine and Russia feel in a way safe in the future. Now, we're very far away from that moment, but I think we really need to start thinking also in those terms. So these analyses and these proposals are not completely far-fetched. The Russians in turn have talked about the demilitarization of the entire Ukraine, which is also not acceptable. But I think that we need to be thinking about mechanisms that can eventually in the future, I'm not saying now in the short term, but eventually, that reduce the tension and create security guarantees on all sides. But this, is unfortunately still, we're very, very far away from that.
Okay, Dr. Domitilla Sagramoso, thank you very much for joining us in our briefing room today.